Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss any update from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Join the only official Telegram channel of Rouse IAS Study Circle to get the relevant materials and important updates. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of the newspaper analysis. So today we are going to discuss the Hindu Daily Edition dated 1st December 2021. The topics to be discussed has been displayed on your screen and the time stamping of the same has been provided in the description box below. So now, moving on to our first topic which has appeared on page number 6. The topic reads Afghanistan, the rise of narco-terrorist state. Now this topic is in context of the security challenges which India face in the backdrop of rise of Taliban in the Afghanistan. So the context of this topic is that according to a report published by United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, that is UNODC, the opium production in Afghanistan has crossed 6,000 tons for the fifth consecutive year. Now there is a well-proven data that one of the major factors behind rise of Taliban in Afghanistan is the illegal opium trade in which they were involved. So today in this discussion we will analyze all the security challenges which India faces because of the changing geopolitical situation in its neighborhood. In the UPSC scheme of syllabus, this topic falls under the General Studies paper 3 and the section of security, and in the micro section of role of external state and non-state actors creating challenges to internal security. Now this topic is very important from the UPSC point of view, and to prove this I have taken 3 sample questions from UPSC in different years. For example, in 2017 UPSC asked the question, the scourge of terrorism is a grave challenge to the national security. What solutions do you suggest to curb this growing menace, and what are the major sources of terror funding? Now, if you closely analyze this question, here two things are related. One is the terrorism, and it is linked with the national security. Moreover, you are asked to tell the solutions and also you have to analyze the sources of terror funding. Now, as we discussed in the beginning of this topic, that the narco trade is one of the biggest factor responsible for the rise of Taliban in the state of Afghanistan because it provided them the terror fund. Similarly, in the same year, UPSC asked another question. The question read that the northeastern region of India has been infested with insurgency for a very long time. Analyze the major reasons for the survival of the armed insurgency in this region. Now you can imagine that if the question has been asked specifically to the northeastern India, then we might have the question in the upcoming mains in the context of northwestern border also. And there the Pakistan and Afghanistan are one of the major stakeholders in the India's internal as well as external security ecosystem. Now last question is from UPSC 2019. The question says that the cross-border movement of insurgents is only one of the several security challenges facing the policing of the border in northeastern India. Examine the various challenges currently emanating across the India-Myanmar border and discuss the steps to counter the challenge. Now similarly in this question again the northeastern border has been asked, and the question also looks at the broader perspective, that is cross-border movement of insurgents is only one of the several security challenges. This means that there are other security challenges also which we need to look upon. So in this backdrop, we will discuss today the northwestern area of our country and the security implications for India in the backdrop of rise of narco-terrorist state, that is Afghanistan. Now, in order to understand all the dimensions associated with this issue, you need to understand the present status of India and its neighborhood relations in its northwestern area. The location of India is such that we are bounded by some unfriendly countries. For example, on the western side we have Pakistan and on the eastern side we have China. This northern area of India is having a rugged topography. And to the south we have Indian Ocean and a very long coastline above 7500 of kilometers, and this region faces a maritime security challenges. Now we come to the bilateral relations with the countries in this area. We all are aware about the India-Pakistan relation and all the issues associated. There is one more country, Iran, with which India presently shares friendly relations. Here we are having several billions of dollars of investment in terms of port construction and other areas. And then here we have Afghanistan, the geopolitical as well as geostrategic hotspot of this region. Now, first, we will analyze the prevailing conditions in the Afghanistan. Now, it is believed that Taliban is still cash strapped and it is still looking to establish the semblance of the order in the country, and it could indeed be looking to generate its revenue from the illegal cash crop, and that is the opium. And this claim is not just made in the air. We have authentic and trustworthy studies too. For example, a report by United States Special Inspector General for Afghanistan estimated that Taliban derived up to 60% of their annual revenue from illegal narcotics. Further, in this region, we also have several other organizations working, like the Haqqani Network, Al Qaeda, ISK, Lashkar-e-Taiba. Now, it is believed that Pakistan has supported these organizations with the prime objective to create a security threat for India. Various components of Taliban, as also its allies like Al Qaeda, ISK, are under the control or influence of Pakistan, which since its inception is focused on creating the problems for India using terrorism. And then in this region, we have Kashmiri militants. So just imagine the quantum of the threat which India faces in case these organizations tie up with the Kashmiri militants supported by China. Will not India face not just two front wars but three front wars? The two fronts will be from the external side and the one front will be from within the India, that is from the Kashmiri militants. Further, it is also believed that from Afghanistan, the illegal drugs are entering India through two major routes. One is the land route, which is supported by the Pakistan, and the other is the maritime route, where the borders are not very clearly defined, and there are several lacunas in our maritime security strategy because the coastal borders are very porous, and the outcome of those porous borders was the Taj attack. We have already faced the brunt of those attacks. So the experts believe that for the past several decades, Afghan opiates have entered India through circuitous routes, sea as well as air, involving Pakistan, Sri Lanka, African countries such as Mozambique and South Africa, and Qatar. And this is also supported by the recent case which was there in Gujarat, whereby around 3000 kg of heroin was captured by our intelligence agencies, and this heroin tracks back to the Afghanistan. And this shows that how intensely the Taliban group is taking the illegal opium trade as a backbone to finance their terror activities. And as we are also aware that this region is particularly very important for the India's economic and strategic point of view, because these are the major sea lanes through which India connects with the Arabian Peninsula. And Arabian Peninsula is one of the biggest sources for the crude oil imports for India. So just imagine the potential of the threat that if the Talibani and Pakistani nexus gains control over this region, how detrimental will it be for the strategic interests of India? So that is why it is said that destabilization of the Afghanistan will not just destabilize one country, but it is the problem of the entire region, and whereby the Indian interests for us are prominent. And that is why the foreign as well as the security policymakers of India must frame their policies in order to tackle this rapidly changing scenario in its neighborhood. And that is why now we need to look at what future strategy India should adopt. First, because the challenge is not restricted for the one country alone, it is a challenge for the entire region, and that is why India should go for the multi country cooperation, and it should leverage the international platforms like Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the SARC. Second, it should take steps for the border diplomatic engagements, and the special envoy for the Afghanistan reconciliation can be deployed. The third step is in relation to strengthening of the comprehensive integrated border management system with the help of electronic sensors in order to stop the illegal insurgency from the northwestern area, which is mainly done with the help of Pakistan. Then further, in order to tackle the maritime security challenges, the maritime surveillance needs to be enhanced, covering the entire Indian Ocean region with as much preciseness as possible. Further, the capacity of the local police in the states of Jammu Kashmir, Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Delhi needs to be strengthened in order to ensure proper law and order and to track the local criminals which are involved in illegal drug trade. Further, you must be aware about the new emerging cybersecurity challenge that is called as dark web. Now it is estimated that many of the illegal trade goes through the dark web, and that is why India should build up its cybersecurity infrastructure in order to tackle the challenges emanating from the dark web. Now recently there was a Delhi Regional Security Dialogue in India, and this was attended by the security czars of Russia, Iran, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, which means that it was a collaboration of the Central Asian countries, Russia, and India. And India has hosted this dialogue to form a common approach for practical cooperation in confronting the increasing threat of terrorism, radicalization, and drug trafficking following the Taliban's takeover of Kabul. Now, summing up the entire topic in brief once again, this article has appeared in today's newspaper, page number 6, and it reads Afghanistan, the rise of narco terrorist state. Here we analyze that this theme is very important from the UPSC examination point of view because almost every year this theme has been asked in different contexts. Sometimes it is asked in the northeastern context, sometimes it is asked in the relation of terrorism and organized crime. Now coming to this part, we analyze that because of the location of the India, it faces several internal as well as external challenges, and how Indian interests in Afghanistan and Iran are of paramount importance. But again, we analyze that Afghanistan is becoming a new hotspot of terror activities with the help of rise of Taliban and the associated smaller groups. Now these groups are supported by Pakistan, which we all know that is a continuous security threat for India. On the eastern border, we have China. Further, the maritime domain which surrounds the India is of very importance, but at the same time, it is characterized by several porous borders through which the insurgents or the drug peddlers intrude within the borders of India. And that is why to tackle all these multi-dimensional security challenges, the future strategy which India should take should be built on the pillars of multi-country cooperation, border diplomatic engagements, using technology for the comprehensive integrated border management and maritime surveillance. Further, in order to ensure internal security, the government should focus on the capacity building of the local police and it must also beef up its cyber security infrastructure to tackle the dark web. And in this context, we saw the current affair which was in relation to the recent Delhi Regional Security Dialogue, whereby Russia, India, and countries from Central Asia took place in order to devise a strategy to tackle this specific challenge in relation to the rise of Taliban in Afghanistan. Now moving to our second topic which has appeared in the lead article in the Hindu newspaper. The article is mentioned at the page number 6 and it reads the small grants but big opportunity for the local bodies. Now this topic is in relation to the grants made by 15th Finance Commission in the context of health to the local bodies in rural as well as urban areas. Further, this topic discusses in detail the present status of the primary healthcare in rural as well as urban areas. And that is why in this topic we will discuss the dimensions associated with the status of the primary healthcare in India, the challenges associated as well as the way forward. Now first of all, we will look at the context of this topic. The context says that in early November 2021, the Finance Ministry has released around rupees 8,000 crore to 19 states as a health grant to rural and urban local bodies. This allocation has been made as a part of the health grant of 70,000 crore which was recommended by the 15th Finance Commission. Now this topic is interrelation of multiple topics. For example, it also has the sections of Indian polity and constitution, and it also has a section of social justice because this topic deals with the health situation in our country. So that is why two micro sections of the UPSC scheme of syllabus fits for this topic. The first one is related to the devolution of the powers and finances up to local level and challenges therein. And the second dimension is the issues relating to the development and management of the social sector, particularly the health sector. Now, this topic is also relevant from the examination point of view because there have been questions asked in the past. For example, in UPSC 2018, the question was asked that appropriate local community level healthcare. Now, please note this word. Local community level healthcare intervention is a prerequisite to achieve health for all in India. Explain. This question shows the importance of grassroots interventions in health sector in order to ensure inclusive health for all in India. And that is why today we'll discuss all the dimensions associated with the primary health care in India. So first we will look at the historical context. In year 1992, as the part of the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments, the local bodies were created. These local bodies in the rural areas were known as Panchayati Raj institutions, and in the urban areas they were called as municipalities. Now these municipalities could be councils and corporations. Now, the constitutional sanctions to these local bodies were given in order to encourage the decentralized governance in India. It was hoped that this decentralized government will ensure better outcomes in especially the social sectors like education and health in rural as well as urban areas. Talking specifically about the health, the hope was that this would result in greater attention to and the allocation of funds for the health services in the geographical jurisdiction of the local bodies. Further, alongside with this, the rural areas continue to receive several other funds in schemes associated with the education as well as the health sector. So this amendment was in addition to the money which the areas were already getting under several other schemes. This additional funds was to be used for the betterment of the society at the grassroots level. So now in order to analyze that what is the present status, how far the aims which were there seen during the 73rd and 74th amendments are fulfilled, first we need to look at the present structure of the primary healthcare in rural as well as urban areas. First, we will study the healthcare infrastructure in rural areas. In rural areas, there are three levels of intervention. The first is the sub-center, the second is the primary healthcare center, and the third one is the community health center. Now, these structures differ in many aspects. For example, the subcenters are the most peripheral contact between the primary healthcare system and the community. Above this subcenter, we have a primary health center, and it is a referral unit for 6 subcenters, which means that this primary health centers coordinates 6 subcenters, and that is why primary health center comes in the upper level of hierarchy as compared to the subcenter. Above the primary health center, we have community health centers, which cater to 4 primary health centers, and this also provides special services. Similarly, in the urban areas, we have two levels of engagement. The first one is the primary health center, and the other one is the community health center. Now, these health centers also differ in terms of the number of people which they can cater to. For example, in urban areas, primary health center cater to around 50,000 people, and whereas the community health center cater to around 2.5 lakh people. So the point is that there is a hierarchy of the institutions in the healthcare at the grassroots, that is local levels in urban as well as the rural areas. Moreover, as you all might be aware about the recent Ayushman scheme, which aimed to create the health and wellness centers across India. So that is why, in order to ensure the delivery of the comprehensive primary healthcare services, the existing urban primary health centers are being converted into health and wellness centers. And these health and wellness centers will focus on the mobile medical units, health camps, home visits, and community based interaction. So, this is the present status of the healthcare system at the grassroots level in terms of the hierarchy of the institutions established. Now we come to the challenges part. There are some challenges which are common to rural as well as urban areas, but there are other challenges which are unique also. So we will look at both these challenges. So the first challenge in these rural areas is the vast stretch of India having lakhs of villages. This vast and diverse geographical location of India inhibits proper penetration of healthcare delivery in such areas. The second biggest challenge is the reluctance of the healthcare personnel in these areas because they are reluctant to work at the block or below the block level as they have to face two main challenges. The first important challenge is related to the poor standard of living which are there in our villages. So that is why several health personnel, including the doctors, are not willing to go to the villages. And the second important challenge is that they feel that there will not be any opportunity to translate their technical skills on ground in such areas because these areas face the crunch of capital, innovation, technology, manpower. So many doctors feel that if they go to those areas, it will be a complete wastage of their skills. But the urban areas have their unique challenges as compared to the rural areas. Many a times our focus is mostly on the rural areas healthcare infrastructure which is fraught with several challenges, and we tend to ignore the healthcare facilities available in the urban areas. But this is not the case. The urban areas also have several unique challenges, and today we will look into those challenges. The first and the biggest challenge in urban areas is the lack of coordination and clarity on the responsibilities related to the health services. Because we know that in urban areas there are multitude of agencies which are responsible for different types of health services. And this in turn creates a confusing and a complex ecosystem which is many a times fraught with red tapeism. And that is why it is the public which suffers at the cost of the bureaucratic red tapeism in the urban areas. The second challenge is the low budgetary allocation, which has never crossed more than rupees 1000 crore budgetary allocation of the National Rural Health Mission. That means that compared to the rural areas, the urban areas have a lower share of the budgetary allocation for their health care services. It is estimated that if we divide the total number of people living in the urban areas and the amount which these municipalities are getting for their healthcare services, the figure comes out to be as low as rupees 25 per urban resident. But this corresponding figure in the rural areas is around rupees 4000 per person, which means that in rural areas per person expenditure on health is around rupees 4000 by these local bodies, whereas in the urban areas it is as meager as rupees 25. Then the next challenge comes in terms of lower utilization. In urban settings, most of the local bodies were spending from less than 1% to around 3% of their annual budget, which means that firstly, they were not getting the required budget, and out of that budget which they were getting, the utilization of that budget was further at a lower level. The next challenge is that urban areas have several competing spending priorities, which means that urban areas, because of the higher demographic load and because of higher citizenry expectations, they have to spend in multiple areas in education, in street lighting, in maintaining the law and order, in healthcare services, in old age services. So, all these services put a tremendous pressure on the urban local bodies that where they should spend their budget first. So that is why many a times it happens that the healthcare services lag behind. And the last challenge is the lack of infrastructure. Urban India, with just half of the rural population, has just one sixth of the primary health centers in comparison to rural areas. And in this backdrop, that the Finance Commission Health Grant, the urban share is nearly five-fold that of the annual budget of the National Urban Health Mission, and rural allocation is 1.5-fold that of the total health spending by the rural local bodies in India, is an unprecedented opportunity. And this is the very context, the very core theme which this article talks about. Now we will look at some of the steps which can be taken as a future strategy in order to build and increase the resilience of our primary healthcare system in India. The first is that this grant which is allocated should be used as an opportunity to sensitize all the stakeholders in local bodies, including the elected representatives, councillors, administrators, etc. Second, the awareness of citizens about the responsibilities of the local bodies in healthcare services should be raised. Such an approach can work as an empowering tool to enable the accountability. Third, the civil society organizations need to play a greater role in raising the awareness about the role of local bodies in health and possibly in developing the local dashboards as a mechanism of accountability to track the progress made in the health initiatives. Fourth, the mechanisms for better coordination among multiple agencies working in rural as well as the urban areas should be institutionalized. And the last one is to establish community clinics in different areas. You should know this that before the novel coronavirus pandemic started, a number of state governments and cities had planned to open various types of community clinics in rural and urban areas. So, this is the time to go for it. So, summing up the entire topic in brief once again, this topic has appeared in the context of the recent grants which have taken place on the basis of the recommendation of the 15th Finance Commission to ensure the better healthcare services in the local areas. The local areas belong to rural as well as the urban regions, and the 73rd and 74th Constitutional Amendment Act gave the sanctions to the local bodies in rural areas as well as urban areas in order to strengthen the grassroots decentralized governance system. Then we analyzed about the structure which presently we have in rural and urban areas, which are characterized by the hierarchical level of healthcare institutions. In the rural areas, at the lowest level, we have sub-center, and in the urban areas, we have primary health center. However, under the Ayushman Bharat scheme, these urban primary health centers are being converted into health and wellness centers. But despite having well institutionalized mechanism, there are several challenges which primary health sector faces in rural as well as urban areas. For example, in rural areas, there is a major concern of the health professionals because of the reduced standard of living and lack of opportunity to implement their skills. They feel reluctant to be posted in the rural areas. But the urban areas also have their unique challenges in terms of lack of coordination, low budget, low utilization, competing spending priorities, and lack of infrastructure. But our job is to overcome these challenges, and therefore we should be adopting a future strategy based on the pillars of sensitizing the stakeholders, ensuring the community awareness and leveraging the civil society organizations for this, ensuring a proper rural urban coordination, and establishing the community clinics which were aimed by several states and cities in the pre-COVID times. So, moving on to our next topic, which is related to the parliamentary functioning. This topic has appeared on the text and the context page, and this topic talks about the deteriorating level of the parliamentary scrutiny over several bills. As we all know that one of the major functions of the parliament is to keep a regulatory oversight on the functioning of the executive, to discuss and debate various provisions of the bills and come up with the best provisions which are suitable to the citizens of this country. However, during the recent times it has been witnessed that the parliamentary scrutiny over these bills is deteriorating. There have been ample evidences of increasing politicization within the parliament, because of which bills are being passed in haste. This topic falls under the General Studies Paper 2 syllabus of the Constitution and Polity and the micro section of the Parliament and State Legislatures structure, functioning, the conduct of business, powers and privileges, and issues arising out of these. So, the Article 85 of the Constitution deals with the session of the Parliament, prorogation, and dissolution. It says that the President shall from time to time summon each House of Parliament to meet at such time and place as he thinks fit, but with one very important condition, that the period of 6 months shall not intervene between its last sitting in one session and the date appointed for its first sitting in the next session, which means that the maximum time between two sessions can be 6 months. The important point to be noted here is that the Constitution does not prescribe the 3 sessions of Parliament. We all know that presently it is a convention that Parliament has 3 sessions, that is the monsoon session, the budget session, and the winter session. So now first we will discuss that what exactly do we mean by the disruption of the parliamentary proceedings. Many a times in news you might have watched or heard about the walkouts in the parliament. There are several images in our mind fresh of roaring and shouting in the parliament. So do all these things comes under disruption of the parliamentary proceedings? No. The disruptions encompass an undesired statement, action, and gesture that not only delay the transaction of the business, this thing is important, that the transaction of the business should be delayed, that not only delays the transaction of the business in parliament, but it also violates the behavioral protocol that every MP is required. The disruption also includes the showing of placards, shouting of slogans, entering the well of the house, and repeated call for adjournment. However, the walkouts from the house, important thing, the walkouts from the house do not fall within the scope of the disruptions, but rather they constitute a legitimized form of protest. Because the walkouts are a symbol to protest against some bill or the provisions of those bill, so that is why it comes under the freedom of speech article 19 and has been considered a legitimate form of protest. But a very problematic thing is happening. Studies suggest that increased disruptions of the parliament and state legislative assemblies has impacted the legislature's core functioning of lawmaking. Now, the general provision is that the bills are sent to the parliamentary committees in order to have a detailed discussion and analysis of all the provisions of those bills. But in the past years, it has been witnessed that the percentage of bills sent to the committees have drastically reduced. For example, during the 14th Lok Sabha, the percentage of bills sent to committee was 60%, and it increased in the 15th Lok Sabha to 71%. However, in the 16th Lok Sabha, that is 2014 to 19 period, it reduced dramatically to just 27%, and in the ongoing Lok Sabha till now it is around 12%. But this data raises the question that what are the prime reasons behind these parliamentary disruptions? Why is it so that year by year the parliamentary scrutiny is being reduced? The first and the important reason is that the matters related to some controversy or public importance are not discussed much because every political party has a fear of losing some votes in case they engage in the controversial topics. For example, the demand for the discussion on the Pegasus snooping and the farm laws. So the political party have this continuous threat, and to achieve their political gains, they do not enter into the debates related to such controversial topics. The second reason is that the opposition members come together as a group to block the key bills in Rajya Sabha. The third important thing is that it is also one of the measures which ruling party takes to evade the responsibility on key aspects of governance and policy measures. Further, it also has been observed that with the rise in the number of political parties, the time availability to discuss those bills have been reduced, and hence there is a lack of dedicated time for the unlisted discussions also. Nevertheless, all these reasons, though, are responsible for the parliamentary disruptions, but they have a wide ranging impact on multiple things. For example, they negatively impact the governance in the country, and which in turn affect the lives of the citizens in multiple ways. It shows the lack of concern by the elected members, and their performance deficit goes unaccounted. Further, it also leads to the passing of the budget of various departments without any discussion, which in turn increases the wasteful expenditure. And this in turn leads to disproportionate and unbalanced financial allocation among various departments. Further, another important trend has been witnessed that because of this reducing accountability, the ruling government take the route of ordinances in order to bypass the legislation of the parliament. Take the route of ordinances in order to bypass the legislative and the supervisory role of the parliament. And this brings us to certain steps which should be taken in order to reform our parliament. The first is that compulsory presence of the prime minister during the question and the 0 hour, and this thing is practiced in country like Britain. So we can also adopt that practice. The second is that there should be both the pre as well as the post legislative impact assessment for the quality and the informed lawmaking. Further, the departmental standing committees should be given a longer tenures in order to have a better discussion for a longer period of time. The fourth important thing is passing of the Constitution 108th Amendment Bill, which relates to the women reservation in Parliament. Because it has been witnessed that due to lack of participation of the women in Parliament, there are several bills which do not take into account the concerns which especially women face. Further, some experts have also suggested that the code of conduct of law should be made enforceable by court of law in order to enhance the compliance of the rules of both the houses. And the rules which specifically relate to the interruptions of the proceedings should apply automatically. Further, the roster system to ensure the attendance and quorum should be fixed at 50%, and the attendance, participation in debates, and the questions raised should be published by the Secretariat. Further, the intra-party democracy is also the need of the hour, and that is why the political parties must ensure that opportunities are given to new entrants. And in order to reduce the criminalization of politics, the Supreme Court guidelines should be adhered to. The political parties should restrict themselves to give tickets to the people who face criminal charges. Further, the reform of the defection law is also of very much importance. And that is why it has been suggested that the whip system and the anti-defection law should be reviewed, and the powers of the speaker, the freedom of speech should be taken care of. There should be special courts or tribunals in order to fast track the criminal cases pending against the MPs or MLAs. And finally, there should be a coherence between the government and the opposition in terms of the reforming the laws. The opposition should take care that their criticisms are constructive in nature, and the ruling government should take care that they should be responsive towards the views of the opposition. So now is the time for the question of the day. The question asked yesterday was in relation to the hydrogen fuel cells. The question asked that which of the following statements is or are correct about the hydrogen fuel cells. The first statement was that the water vapor is the only byproduct. And the second statement is that it is more efficient than petrol combustion. So in this question, both the statements are correct, and hence the C option is the correct answer. The question for today is that which of the following group of countries are called as Golden Crescent? The options given are Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, B. Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, C. Iran, Afghanistan, and Turkmenistan, or D. Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Kazakhstan.